The beeping of the escape pod's alarm dragged Kalam Hayes from unconsciousness, his head pounding like he'd been hit with a sledgehammer. His vision swam as he blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The pod's dim emergency lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the cramped interior. He tasted copper, his lips split from the impact of whatever had knocked him out. His fingers trembled as he reached for the control panel, the screen cracked but still displaying urgent red warnings. Oxygen levels were dangerously low. Power reserves were at 15%. Worst of all, the navigational data showed that he had been drifting for days, far beyond the boundaries of space. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. He had survived worse. He had to figure out where he was. Kalam twisted in his seat, peering out of the small. What he saw sent a shiver down his spine. A massive, derelict vessel hung in the void, its sheer size dwarfing his tiny escape pod. The ship's hull was dark, ancient, and covered in markings that pulsed faintly, like veins beneath the skin. It looked dead, yet something about it suggested otherwise. His pod's failing systems blared another proximity alert, and before he could react, the emergency docking sequence engaged. The pod's thrusters fired weakly, dragging him toward the behemoth. No, 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 cancel. Kalam barked, his fingers flying across the malfunctioning console. It was useless. Whatever had latched onto him wasn't letting go. The pod trembled as it connected with an airlock, and with a hiss, the docking clamps locked into place. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. A single notification blinked on the display. Pressurization complete. Airlock cycle engaged. The words chilled him. This ship should have been a lifeless husk, yet it still had a functional atmosphere. That was impossible. His pod door unlocked with a sharp hiss, revealing a dark corridor beyond. Kalam hesitated, every instinct telling him to stay put. But he was running out of oxygen, and the pod wouldn't last much longer. Swallowing his fear, he grabbed his toolkit and flashlight before stepping onto the unknown vessel. The air inside was cold but breathable, with a metallic tang that reminded him of blood. The walls stretched high above him, their surfaces smooth and black, reflecting his flickering flashlight beam. Strange patterns ran along the bulkheads, lines and symbols that shifted when he tried to focus on them, like they weren't meant to be seen by human eyes. His boots echoed too loudly on the floor, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. It was too quiet. No hum of active machinery, no distant clatter of shifting debris. Just silence, pressing down on him like a weight. His radio crackled to life, a burst of static making him jump. He hadn't activated it. The channels were all open, but there was no response. Just a deep, droning interference that sent goosebumps down his arms. He moved forward cautiously, eyes scanning for anything resembling a control center. If he could access the ship's systems, he might be able to figure out where he was, and more importantly, if there was a way off. As he walked, the lights overhead flickered. He stopped dead in his tracks. They weren't flickering randomly, they were coming on in sequence, leading him forward. His pulse hammered in his ears. This ship was abandoned. It had to be. And yet something was guiding him. The corridor opened into a vast chamber lined with consoles. Screens flickered to life as he approached, bathing the room in an eerie blue glow. His fingers hovered over a cracked interface, debating whether to touch it. The moment his skin made contact, the entire ship seemed to exhale. A deep, resonant vibration pulsed through the floor, up his legs, into his bones. The screens rapidly cycled through data, unreadable symbols flashing across the displays before settling on something he could understand. Welcome back. Kalam's blood ran cold. His breath hitched, and he stumbled backward, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had never been here before. This ship was alien. How could it possibly recognize him? His radio crackled again, but this time, beneath the static, he swore he heard something. A whisper, just on the edge of comprehension. His flashlight flickered. The temperature dropped sharply, and for the first time, he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. A shadow, just at the periphery of his vision, standing in the doorway he had just come through. A shape, tall and humanoid, but featureless, its edges bleeding into the darkness like smoke. It did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. But he felt it watching. A cold sweat broke over his skin. Slowly, he reached for his radio. "This is Callum Hayes," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "If anyone is out there, I think I just made contact." The figure shifted, just slightly. The ship groaned around him, meta-bending as if something enormous stirred deep within its walls. The words on the screen changed. Callum forced himself to breathe as he backed away from the console, his mind racing through a dozen possible explanations, each more impossible than the last. The ship's screens continued their eerie flickering. The words "Welcome back" burned into his thoughts like a brand. He had never been here before. He was sure of it. And yet, something on this ship recognized him, or at least, it wanted him to believe it did. The shadow in the doorway remained still, featureless, its presence warping the air around it. Callum swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight tighter. Slowly, he reached for his tool belt, his fingers brushing against the worn handle of his plasma cutter. It wasn't much, but the thought of having something, anything, to defend himself gave him a small sense of control. The moment his fingers curled around it, the figure in the doorway moved. It didn't step forward. It didn't even seem to walk. It simply shifted, as if reality had momentarily forgotten where it was supposed to be and placed it closer to him. Callum's breath hitched. His instinct screamed at him to run, but something deeper, something primal, warned him not to turn his back. He forced himself to remain still, watching as the thing loomed just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. He could see no eyes, no features, but somehow, he knew it was watching him. It was waiting. The ship groaned, meta-creaking as if something enormous stirred within its structure. The vibrations pulsed beneath his feet, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The lights flickered again, this time in a sequence, first to his left, then further down the corridor, leading away from the shadow. A direction. A path. The ship was guiding him again. Callum's throat was dry as he made his choice. Slowly, carefully, he took a step sideways, inching toward the path the lights had illuminated. The shadow didn't react. Another step. Still nothing. Keeping his eyes locked on the figure, he moved again, forcing himself not to blink, not to look away. The second he crossed the threshold into the next corridor, the lights behind him snapped off. Darkness swallowed the room he had left behind, the presence vanishing with it. Callum let out a shaky breath, but he didn't slow down. He followed the lights, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long, lined with doors that had no labels, no markings, just smooth metal that reflected his wavering light. He didn't dare open them. Every instinct told him this ship wasn't just abandoned. It was something else entirely. Something that wasn't meant to be found. Then, the whispering started. At first, it was barely there, just a faint static crackle in his radio. He adjusted the dial, hoping, praying, that it was a stray signal, some indication that there was someone else out there. But as he walked, the sound grew clearer. Words, just on the edge of understanding, spoken in a voice that was neither human nor entirely alien. It wove through the ship like a breeze through dead leaves, shifting from one side of the corridor to the other, always just out of reach. Then, a single word broke through. "Run!" Callum's breath caught. The lights ahead of him flickered violently, and suddenly, the floor beneath his feet trembled. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, growing in intensity. Something was waking up. He didn't need to be told twice. He broke into a sprint, his boots pounding against the metal as the ship itself seemed to pulse around him. Doors along the hallway rattled in their frames, as if something inside was trying to get out. The whispering grew more urgent, overlapping voices rising in an unseen chorus. The walls warped, the symbols he had seen before shifting, twisting, rewriting themselves before his very eyes. He wasn't supposed to be here. This ship, this place, it wasn't meant to be found. A blessed door at the end of the corridor began to slide shut. His only exit. Callum pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his legs. The metal shrieked as it moved, but he was faster. At the last second, he dove forward, rolling as the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang. He lay there for a moment, gasping, his body shaking. The whispers had stopped. The vibrations had ceased. Slowly, he sat up, his flashlight beam sweeping the room. It was a command center of some kind. Large monitors lined the walls, displaying nothing but static. A massive central console loomed before him, its surface covered in symbols that glowed faintly. And there, in the very center of the room, was something that made his blood run cold. A chair. A pilot's chair. It was built for a human. Callum took a shaky step forward, his fingers brushing over the worn leather of the seat. The controls were sleek, familiar in a way that made his stomach churn. A terminal blinked to life beside him. Words scrolled across the screen, their meaning sinking into him like a knife. You were always meant to return. His hands trembled as he backed away. This ship wasn't just ancient. It wasn't just abandoned. It had been waiting. For him. The whispering started again, soft, almost reassuring this time. The screens flickered, images flashing too quickly to register. Stars, planets, and familiar constellations. A map. A destination. Callum clenched his fists. He had two choices. Run back the way he came, back to the pod with no fuel, no way to escape, or sit in that chair and find out where this ship wanted to take him. The whispering grew softer, like a breath against his ear. Take your seat. Callum gripped the armrests of the pilot's chair as the ship's systems flared to life around him. The hum of unseen engines vibrated through the metal, pulsing in time with something deeper, something almost alive. The controls lit up beneath his fingertips, responding to his presence as though it had always been meant for him. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a steady rhythm of soft chimes and the occasional flickering of symbols on the screen. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming that he should get up, that he should leave, but the ship held him in place, not physically, but in some unseen, unfathomable way. The central console flickered, lines of strange text scrolling across it, some of it shifting into English, as if the ship was learning, adjusting. Course locked. Awaiting confirmation. Callum swallowed. Course? Confirmation? He didn't even know where he was, let alone where this ship intended to take him. His hands hovered over the controls, uncertain, before something caught his eye, a small, blinking marker on the edge of the display. A map. Or at least, what he assumed was a map. He tapped the screen, and suddenly, the entire front darkened before exploding into a display of deep space. A star chart, vast and intricate, stretched across his vision, but his focus locked onto a single point pulsing faintly in the vast cosmic abyss. It was close. Too close. Then, the ship moved. It wasn't like the sluggish drift of a derelict vessel or the clunky propulsion of a standard thruster. It was silent, smooth, like slipping through water without resistance. The stars outside the shifted subtly, confirming what he already felt deep in his bones. The ship had made its decision. His breath hitched, and he slammed a hand against the console. Stop. Cancel course. But the ship did not stop. The whispering returned. Not chaotic or frantic this time, but deliberate, calm, wrapping around his mind like a dream. A voice, familiar yet impossible, whispered, "You need to see." The stars blurred as the ship accelerated, the edges of the distorting, bending reality itself. He wasn't traveling through normal space anymore. The sensation of movement wasn't just physical, it was mental, pressing against the edges of his perception. The symbols on the screens flickered again, cycling through languages, searching for meaning, before one phrase solidified. Arrival imminent. Callum braced himself, but the transition was seamless. One moment, the ship was slipping through the void, and the next, it was still. The adjusted, the distortion fading, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. A planet. Or at least, what had once been a planet. Now, it was nothing more than a broken husk, split apart like a shattered mirror, massive fragments of land masses floating in the dark, connected by eerie strands of glowing energy. Storms raged in the cracks between the fragments, flickering with unnatural lightning. The surface, what remained of it, was eerily smooth, devoid of any natural formations. No mountains, no oceans. Just an endless, pale surface reflecting the dim light of a dying star. Something had done this. And it wasn't natural. The ship drifted closer, its systems scanning the ruins below. The whispering had faded, replaced by something heavier, an overwhelming sense of loss. He could feel it pressing against his chest, a weight that had no sails. The ship's display shifted, overlaying faint outlines over the planet's surface, revealing what had once been there. Cities. Massive structures that stretched across entire continents, now reduced to little more than ghostly imprints. A civilization had once thrived here. And it was gone. Then, the console lit up again. A final message burned across the screen in a language that had not been there before. English. Clear. Precise. They came. We failed. You are all that remains. Kalam's hands clenched into fists. His mind struggled to process the words, to piece together what they meant. Who was speaking? Who had failed? And why did the ship bring him here? His breathing came faster, his pulse hammering. Then, something outside the moved. A shadow, barely distinguishable against the ruined backdrop, drifting through the debris like it had always been there. It was enormous, its form shifting in ways that defied logic, impossible to fully comprehend. For a brief moment, Kalam thought it was part of the wreckage, just another floating remnant of a dead world. Until it turned. Until it saw him. His breath froze in his throat. There were no eyes. No discernible features. And yet he knew beyond any doubt that it was looking at him. The ship shuddered beneath him, warning lights flaring as if reacting to the presence. The whispering returned, but this time, it wasn't from the ship. It was from outside. You should not have come. The ship's systems flared, its engines roaring to life. Kalam barely had time to react as the ship pulled away, moving faster than before, the broken planet shrinking rapidly behind him. The presence remained in the distance, watching, waiting, but it did not pursue. Not yet. The whispering faded again, replaced by a single, final message blinking on the screen. Prepare. Kalam closed his eyes, his pulse still racing. He didn't know what was coming. He didn't know why this ship had chosen him. The ship drifted silently through the void, far from the shattered remnants of the lost world. The hum of its engines had settled into a rhythmic pulse, steady and constant, yet Kalam could feel the tension pressing against the walls, a presence that had not fully left. He sat in the pilot's chair, staring at the control panel, watching as the symbols shifted, processing, recalibrating. The last message still flickered across the screen. Prepare. But for what? His fingers hovered over the controls, hesitating. Every instinct told him to leave, to find a way home, if there even was a home left for him. But the ship had its own intentions. It had brought him here, shown him something he could barely comprehend, and now it waited, watching. A soft chime echoed through the cockpit. A new set of coordinates had appeared on the display, and like any he had seen before. They weren't mapped to any known star chart, no recognizable system name, just a single designation blinking ominously. Point 0. The ship's engines rumbled in response as if it already knew the way. Kalam inhaled sharply, gripping the edges of the chair. I'm not ready for this. The words came out as barely a whisper, but the ship didn't care. It was moving again. The transition was instantaneous, far smoother than before. The moment he blinked, space had shifted, stretching and folding into itself. The ship emerged in darkness, not the endless void of space, but something deeper, something unnatural. There were no stars here, no distant galaxies or cosmic dust. It was empty, oppressively empty. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them. Silhouettes. Not ships, not celestial bodies, but figures. Massive figures, floating in the abyss, their outlines barely distinguishable against the blackness. Their forms pulsed faintly, like embers struggling to ignite, but they did not move, did not react. Kalam swallowed hard. They weren't just floating. They were waiting. He could feel it. The ship slowed, gliding through the eerie silence. Every hair on his body stood on end as he tried to count them, but the more he looked, the more appeared, stretching endlessly into the dark. Some were humanoid, others less so. Their proportions were wrong, arms too long, torsos too narrow, heads that shifted between shapes as if undecided on a form. His breath quickened. These weren't natural beings. They weren't alive in the way he understood. A vibration rattled through the ship, and for the first time, the ship itself seemed hesitant. The lights flickered. The engines pulsed irregularly. Whatever these things were, even the ship feared them. Then Van moved. Slowly, deliberately, its head turned, locking onto the ship. No eyes, no mouth, just a void where a face should be, yet Kalam felt its gaze burrowing into him. A whisper slithered through his mind, not spoken, not even thought, just a presence. Ununderstanding. You came too soon. The whisper carried no malice, no anger, just an inevitability. Like it had always known this would happen. The others began to shift now, their bodies straightening, their hollow forms pulsing with dim light as if waking from an impossibly long slumber. The ship trembled beneath him, warning lights flaring across the console. Leave. The whisper returned, sharper this time. Urgent. Kalam didn't need to be told twice. He gripped the controls, forcing the ship to turn, but the space around him resisted. It was like trying to move through tar. The ship sluggish, its engines straining. The figures did not pursue, did not reach out, but their presence alone was enough to drag everything down. The ship groaned under the weight of it. Then, one of the figures extended a hand. Just a slow, drifting motion. And space tore open. Kalam barely had time to shield his eyes as a violent rift split through the void, a jagged wound of chaotic energy. Beyond it, he saw glimpses of something, worlds shifting, places that should not exist, things that defied all reason. And through it all, a singular image burned itself into his mind. Earth. But it was not the Earth he knew. Cities, twisted and unnatural, rising toward a sky that cracked with impossible storms. A civilization that was both his and not his. Something had changed. Something had been waiting. The rift pulsed, expanding. If it continued, it would consume everything. The ship's alarms screamed, and Kalam forced his hands to move, slamming the emergency thrusters. The ship lurched violently, breaking free from whatever unseen force had been holding it. As it shot away, the figures in the void watched in silence, and moving, their presence a stark reminder that this was not over. The rift did not close. It remained, pulsing, waiting. The ship, normal space in a violent burst of energy. The stars returned, the familiar emptiness of deep space settling around him. But Kalam was shaking. The whispers had stopped, the ship had gone quiet, but the weight of what he had seen pressed into him like an anchor. He had been shown something humanity was never meant to witness.